I guess we could turn off our individual microphones when we're not speaking.
Yeah, if you want to, guys. Yeah, everyone's just coming in there now, so we'll give them a moment and then we'll start off. So hi everyone. We'll just give 2 minutes to let everyone join, and then we'll start off. Very welcome. If I could ask maybe everyone if they could mute themselves as they're coming in, just hearing a little bit of background interference there. Not sure where it's coming from. Okay, good. So just give 1 more minute, guys, and then we'll kick off.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. Okay, guys, I think I'll get started there now, so we can hopefully keep to our schedule. So guys, you're very welcome to our episode today, the last of our webinar series, Reimagining Sustainable Development, Achieving Resilient Communities. We're delighted to be joined today by a diverse collective, Stefano Semprini, Khalid Jacobs, and Benjamin Mansfield. Han, for sure, you are online. I see your message there, just to mention, all good. So yeah, to continue on. So our 3 speakers have worked on a number of projects in South Africa to date, a number of high impact projects, which they'll be discussing with you, as well as their global systems and climate change adaptive approaches. So Stefano Semprini, to briefly introduce our panelists before we kick off, has trained as a mechatronic engineer and has a background in mechanical design and renewable energy, but is now exploring a number of different fields of activity and currently works with the Integrated Sustainable Development Foundation. Ben Mansfield is one of the directors of the Integrated Sustainable Development Foundation, which is based in Cape Town and Zurich, which is a continuation of the Resilient Civic Design Collective. And Khalid Jacobs is a director of Jacupa Architects and Urban Designers based in Cape Town. So they are our panelists. We might also have someone else possibly joining us later, but for now, they're our 3 panelists. So I'm going to pass over to Stefano, and enjoy the webinar, guys. And as usual, we'll have time for about 10-15 minutes at the end for Q&A. So any questions you have, keep until then, or pop them in the Q&A box. Okay, enjoy, guys.
Cool. Thank you, Emma. Hi, everyone. I'm Stefano.
Hi, Stefano.
So just to make sure,
hi, Feldy.
Feedback earlier. All fine. Okay. Well, I'm going to
there's a tiny bit of feedback, but yeah, you're all good stuff.
Okay, all right.
All good.
So I'm going to start us off just talking about kind of a 10,000-foot view of the systemic perspective of what we're going to be looking at, and why engaging with communities in complexity the way speaking to is so important. So kind of woven through all of it is the nature of the circumstances we find ourselves in, and that is that we're generally ill-equipped with the tools of the bygone era, trying to solve the problems of a new era. Personally, I came to sense this while I was studying mechatronic engineering. I was studying at Samaai University, and I didn't really have the language to describe the issue at the time. But what I understood was that I was being taught problem solving in a narrowly defined box, and no one was really telling me about the box. And I keep being told that problem solving is the essence of what the training is doing capacity as an engineer. The problem was then that the way of thinking about solving problems wasn't taking a holistic systemic perspective. And so this is, there's a long tail and long history to this, but it's essentially, we've arrived at a place where deeply entrenched in our ways of thinking is this idea of man and humankind and nature as a machine. That is that if you take a machine and you take it apart into different pieces, you can understand the whole by understanding the pieces and how they fit together. There's no understanding of the emergent properties that arise out of a whole when you put it back together. And so our environment, the whole that we're playing an ever more prominent role in shaping, is not a machine. And it's a complex network of relationships. And these patterns of organization cannot be understood by isolating the parts and trying to study the system by looking at the parts in isolation. We reduce the system when we do that, and we ignore the emergent properties which arise. And so that, those emergent properties are kind of the heart and soul of the systems we live within. So on the one hand, we have a linear, detail-oriented, deterministic approach to solving problems. And on the other hand, we have an iterative process or set of processes which are focused on the patterns of relationships, right? And that's kind of the bigger picture of where we're going today. Unfortunately, we're all familiar with this idea of paradigm shifts. This was introduced by Thomas Kuhn in his 1962 book, Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And so if I asked you, what do you think was the last major paradigm shift of our time, we'd probably get a large diversity of different answers, and that's a good thing. But unfortunately, we're embedding an adherence to outdated paradigms in the way that we educate and learn. So by structuring the way we introduce new knowledge to young minds into distinct categories, we're affirming and reinforcing a belief that things can be understood, the complexity can be understood by putting them into categories, by taking apart the machine. And then kind of returning to this idea of the core idea of development as a process of change. If we examine how our world is built, we look through organizations. Organizations, be they governments, civic groups, private businesses, or any other form, are structures that we use to manage change at a scale larger than that which any individual can manage. So we want to change and build our world. And first we have to build an organization. I mean, in truth, the two happen together, right? But again, our way of being and our way of thinking informs the nature of the structuring of the organizations we create. And this is really important for where we're going, because many things go wrong when we start to partition organizations. And one of the major issues is communication, for example. How information is generated and how it flows to where it needs to go to enact change or to forestall change that we don't want is really, really important. So this picture is just a bit of a comic about this idea of siloed thinking as organizations, in this instance, companies, and how they grow. So as we go through the presentation, this is one thing I'd love for you to try and keep in mind. This is Sonella Meadows was involved in writing Limits to Growth, and this is an understanding of where we can intervene in a system to create change. As we develop things, and the least effective at the top and the most effective there is at the bottom. And the outdated kind of mechanistic worldview focuses on the three least effective ways of managing and implementing change. And then on the other end of the spectrum, which has been identified as the most powerful way to create change, is the ability to transcend paradigms, to think in radically new ways about problems that exist around us. So this is ultimately about navigating and understanding complexity. And the nature of our complex environment is such that it can't be understood by reducing into little pieces. We can't study each individual piece and then put it back together and think we can make the whole again. So yeah, that's all I have to add from the bigger picture perspective. And Khalid is going to take over now, and he's going to walk us through the complex environment that is our context here in South Africa. And then later on we'll get into some strategies about how we've actually dealt with that complexity. Khalid.
Khalid, you're on mute.
A rookie mistake.
Sorry for that. I want to start a conversation about an event that happened in Cape Town, or started in Cape Town in 2015, where there was a student uprising at the University of Cape Town. And the uprising revolved around the removal of the bust of Cecil John Rhodes, who was a colonialist or governor in Cape Town, representing the British at the time. And his pride of place at the university was toppled when the students used him as a symbol to fight against what they termed as colonialist type of education. But what struck me very immediately as an architect, of course, was that while Cecil John Rhodes is a symbol, as a bust, was a piece of artwork that you can see in the center of this image, the rest of the campus had in fact had the same representation in how it was made, not only in terms of how it's made, but how it's located in the landscape overlooking the city of Cape Town. So while a symbol was removed, the architecture and the construct of the set of ideas that the students were rising up against was in fact a lot more resilient than removing a single piece of artwork. So the set of conversations that I would like to have with you is around this idea that the power of ideas is conveyed through spatial expression. And through this, the city is effectively a set of ideas that has been translated into reality, and therefore can be seen retrospectively as an archive of what our collective actions has been. So, and then finally, of course, you know, in more in alignment with our professions, I would like to make an argument that design is a tool for emancipation. If we're conscious of what the power of the design methodology can be. So I'm going to go through quickly a set of paradigms, and Stefano did a good job of trying to establish the framework for how one can begin imagining the recording of the making of a city. So the first paradigm, and of course I'm using Cape Town as an illustration for the set of ideas that we're trying to convey. So the first paradigm of Cape Town is that when there were people here before the colonialists arrived, but they have been missing from our history notebooks and from maps and recordings in the making of place. So the only representations that one can find, generally speaking, of course, is the representation of people like Sarki Bartman on the right there, who was exported to Europe as an oddity, as a science experiment, as something that referenced the link between people living in Cape Town at the time as being inhuman or being closer to ape than they are to human. And the size of genitals and the like was meant to represent their closeness to the ape. So the dehumanization implied that the land was empty, right, and was therefore ripe for occupation. So that was the first paradigm, and which was followed very closely with obviously the paradigm of the codification of violence or spatial violence in the making of this new order. And it actually was done quite physically, right? So when the Dutch pitched up, they built a fort, which we call a castle for some reason in Cape Town. And the castle was claiming space. And the process of claiming space was extended beyond the corners of the castle by shooting out cannonballs to the four corners, right? And that established a space around that fort. It's in military terms, it's called a glacis, or no man's land. And that established a realm from which the city then developed a set of axes, and the city was then laid out on this set of parameters. Ultimately, the fort was shifted, and you can see as the city grew, the central axis, the vertical axis, is still our main high street, and the location of the fort. This is the second fort that was built or repositioned rather, still remains there. And that grid, the Dutch grid, still is the form of that city. What you see stretching to the right of the fort is the first wall that separated the protected area of the city and the no man's land again outside of that. This diagram shows that CBD in the black hatched diagram, and you'll see that the extension of the territory was incrementally extended as the various parts of the city was found. So that set of ideas around conquering and capturing land as being unoccupied on the one hand, and then a set of fortifications to keep out the wild, including the wild people, is the second set of ideas. The third set of ideas around how Cape Town formed, obviously the British, when the British took over Cape Town, their representation of their culture and their architectural language was kind of replicated in the painting by Henry Ford, and you can see not only in the architecture of the buildings, but also you can see in the clothes the people wore. In this image, at least, was a representative of not something that is in Africa. And of course, that translated very literally in buildings being imported brick by brick into Cape Town, and in fact, all over the world, that represented a set of power relations. So the architecture was physically brought and planted in space. But much more than just the architecture, the land was occupied. And you remember, if you understand that Cape Town, in fact, is not, there are no endemic trees in Cape Town. The entire landscape was reascribed to represent a particular set of ideas. And this landscape, or the remodeling of the landscape, was extensive. So much so that the ideas, the ambition of Cecil John Rhodes was not only to represent the power of the empire in Cape Town, but in fact to connect Cape Town to Cairo. And this is a very famous image that represents that connection, and they used rail to kind of access the hinterland, to access resources and the like. So there's another set of ideas which positions how Cape Town kind of imagined itself. Then came us, maybe not too far back from us. The fourth paradigm of making of our city was this idea that the engineers, through logic and through mathematics, was able to organize the city differently. And of course, the ideas of modernism, we're rejecting the past, and we have the new future. And that new future was, and I'm not sure if many engineers will understand this, but this is a diagram that represented the garden city, the one on the left. The garden city was this idea of separating the dirty functions of the post-industrial city. So we separate work from living, from playing. And this diagram was effectively the birth of suburbia. That was a separation of residential to other functions in the making of a city. In Cape Town or in South Africa, the diagram on the right was an interpretation of this, where in fact the separation of the functions was combined with a separation of race. So modernist ideas was employed by the apartheid state to separate the making of people, or the location of people based on race. Getting back to this, to the gist of the conversation, though, I mean, it's the ideas of the industrial or the Ford factory making and assembling cars was obviously applied to the assembly and making of buildings as well as the city, and that's where the domino construction or the slab and concrete column kind of construction methodology sort of arose, and that was translated to in fact the city. And this image of Le Corbusier on the right shows the separation of cars on the ground floor, people on the level above, and you live above that, effectively in the sky. So not only we begin to separate function on plan, but also vertically. And this is a translation. This is a very poor copy of an image of one of the townships that was, the black townships that was developed in Cape Town, called Nyanga. And complicit to the making of this modernist plus apartheid Cape Town was traffic engineers. And you will understand that traffic engineers tend to talk about demand and destination. Demand, where people need to go to, where people come from, where they live, and destination as to where they work. So this set of ideas then translates very directly to dormitory suburbs where people lived. And in the case of Nyanga, it was male only, because Black people weren't officially allowed in Cape Town. They could only come and work in the city. And this set of ideas effectively has translated into what we understand Cape Town to be now, and many of you have obviously been exposed to that, in that is a set of systemic layers of oppression and dispossession in the making of the city. And that gives you these kinds of discorded organization of the making city. And we want to take this conversation to is where we are today, right, in terms of what is the dynamics of the making of our city today. Right? And it's rooted in some of the social dynamics that has happened, since the 80s, the 1980s, and to date. There's been a sharp increase in unemployment rates in our country. This is a set of stats from the country, not Cape Town, of course, necessarily. But you'll see that about half of our population is not economically active. In other words, they're not measured as part of the unemployment rate. The only measure of the unemployment, as statisticians would tell us, is that if you're looking for a job, and you don't find a job, then you're considered unemployed. So if you combine our not economically active to unemployment, to those who are unemployed, it's the vast majority of South Africans. And this, of course, is exacerbated through our experience with COVID, of course. That problem is a kind of a problem that we're struggling to kind of deal with, and it's incessant. Combine that to what the UN is predicting in terms of the rural-urban migration across Africa. And this is a diagram that shows what South Africa used to be what Africa used to be in 2010 versus where it is expected to go in 2050. And what is clear, and in fact we can see it in action in 2020. We can see this in dramatic effect, where while South Africa was 62% urbanized in 2010, by 2050 the expectation is to be beyond 80% urbanized. So despite a relatively small percentage, if you look at the rest of Africa, for example, of rural urban migration, we can see the dramatic effects now already. The third a very stark reality in South Africa is that a massive discrepancy between those who are the highest income earners to those who are the lowest income earners. So our Gini coefficient is 63%, which is of the worst in the world. And all of this comes together in the making of a city and how it translates into the making of a city. And Professor Edgar Peterson calls this the slum-producing logic of the city, where the demand outstrips the supply. You get this inverted economy, you have these erratic incomes, no tax base, insufficient investment, and so we go around in a circle. And the ability to get out of the cycle has proven to be enormously difficult. So the spatial translations of this is people being shifted from one place to the other. And in this case, it's a place called Blikkiesdorp or Tin Town in English. And it was meant to be a temporary location for people while new homes were being built for them. This has been in existence for now 15 years and more. So it's very, very unlike being temporary. We also have this spatial paradoxes where very high income earning neighborhoods live cheek by jowl next to poverty-stricken communities. And the edge of a city, the edges or the periphery of a city is where there are vast agglomerations of informal settlements. Where there are places where there are formal settlements, and this is Langa, you'll see that every bit of available space that can be found between existing buildings are occupied. If you thought that was dramatic, I'll show you a few more slides which shows the full starkness of or the full extent of the stark processes. This is a place outside of Stellenbosch called Inkeneni, and over just over 10 years, a massive new settlement sprung up. So we have large portions of a settlement being developed over 10 years' time. More complex than that, though, is this is a place called Philippi on the Cape Flats. You'll see from 1988 through to 2012, you see the occupation of a piece of land that was initially farmland, and then those people being dispersed or kicked off the land, then the land being cleared for it to be built, or new houses, homes to be built, and then people reoccupy and people get shifted from one side of the site to the other. But effectively, it is a morphing of the site is continuous. This is a place that we worked on in Claremont, which is about an hour's drive from Cape Town along the coast. And there's an informal settlement on the seaside village. And over the weekend, so we arrived and announced that we have a project to rebuild or provide houses for the informal settlements on the side. And over a weekend, more than 100 new homes appeared. So the speed at which settlement happens is incremental. And beyond that complexity of the speed of informality or the growth of informality is that when our disciplines have laid out plans, this is what has transpired. This is a settlement that you can see the green lines represent urban that has been subdivided, but you can see that the way people have built is not according to ownership. And in fact, the colors, the yellow means residential, or it's zoned as single residential, and the green is in fact public open space. So people have built not only on and across building lines, but also in the public space and in the road reserves as well. So what is planned is very different to what is actually transpiring over time. So the question that we have to ask ourselves, are we actually using the appropriate tools to develop or to manage the growth of these rapidly evolving cities? And in South Africa, we are particularly fortunate that we've got many different tools to help us with planning, from policies, amazing policies, that says all the right things. We've got building regulations. We've got all sorts of layers of plans, from national plans, provincial plans, city plans, down to each building plan having to get planning approval. But clearly, there's also other issues that the city is managing, and it seems to be lurching from crisis to crisis, right? There's rural-urban migration on the one hand, which we've been struggling with drought a few years back, where we had very little water, next to no water left in the dams. We've got an ongoing national problem with the supply of electricity to homes. We've been having huge debates on what spatial justice is, and of course, COVID has been our latest visitor. Now, traditionally, the method of doing plans has been going through quite a lengthy process of doing rezoning, and these processes, environmental processes, building plans approvals, and getting a contractor to site, etc., often takes more than 10 years to do one housing estate. Whereas if you compare a legislated approach like this to what is actually happening on land, on the site, is very, very different. It's starkly different, which means the tools we are using to manage the growth of the city is severely inadequate. Much more than that, of course, is that the tools that we use to engage the city in making the city is clearly geared for those who have the ability to employ the likes of you and me. The rest of the city are having to negotiate their own way. In other words, do so through illegal means to kind of find space or build. And this is the argument that our team is trying to make, right? That this is, in fact, if you see this as the problem, then you'll understand that this is also the opportunity. So in the cases where our cities are being built without government and without professionals, what can we do? And clearly, it's a call to arms. And the gist of what we are arguing is that the shift needs to happen from the deterministic way of designing, as we've all been taught in our formal education processes, to a way that includes time as a factor in the planning processes. So we put an argument forward that you actually need to understand that the making of a city is beyond just you and me. It is about many people, many hands making the city, and that iteration of making the city happens over time, and that the outcomes of that making, that collective making, is in fact unpredictable. So master planning is not the answer to making these plans. And it relies on iteration to build meaning that is a collective meaning. So very briefly, we want to show you some of the strategies that we've employed to demonstrate a different way of working. We've got 8 strategies. I'm going to present one of them, and I think I'll help flip through some of the others. But I'm sure that there are plenty of others, and we encourage everybody to think laterally to be able to understand the problem and then change the way of which we tackle them. So the first strategy is about land, right? And land in Cape Town, South Africa, probably from where you are as well, is a political issue. Access to the opportunity to develop land and make the city is in Cape Town controlled by relatively few people. proportionally. So there's been places where people have been dispossessed through removals, and District 6 is one of those places. So entire neighborhoods have been demolished in Cape Town in the name of apartheid. And the intention was to displace communities like these, where there's been a deep culture, lots of humanity in making the place, etc. And these are clearly very old pictures prior to 1960. And over time, District 6 was demolished. What remains of District 6 is in fact a lot. So in the imagination of many Cape Townians, District 6 is nothing of District 6 that remains. But in fact, there are, if you scratch around on the land, you'll see roads and remnants of walls that was where buildings were just collapsed onto itself and not trucked away. There's religious institutions like the mosque on the top right there that remains. None of the religious institutions, the mosque and the churches remained. New buildings were built, like the university or the technical university to the bottom right. But much more interesting to me is the other stories that get told in the landscape. Like the top left, there's fennel and daisies and the like. So the seedbed of the people of District 6 have remained, and so the gardens, the food gardens that existed in the place also remains. So there's sets of ideas around memory, about landscape, and about the physical infrastructure that in fact remains. And we've set about engaging the community of those who were dispossessed in developing ideas around coming back. And in the beneficiaries' minds, they were only interested in getting back to a house, right? They wanted the house rebuilt. We've subsequently changed that to say that, in fact, restitution is much more than just getting a house back. It's in fact building community, and part of building community in the making of a city is building the public spaces. We then went around a series of workshops. We workshopped through storytelling. So we use collages. So you can see there's a bunch of collages to tell stories and spatialize stories, as opposed to only doing traditional mapping work. We also talked about, we agreed at least, that there's a difference between streets and roads, and that all the roads, these are roads that are all existing in District 6. The top left is a freeway, and the bottom right is a neighborhood road. And that the language of making roads, in this case, is the language of speed and of car, and it's not about people. And that, in fact, the making of streets is a spatial justice issue. And one have to imagine that as public space as much as a square and a lane, for example. So they went through this process of engaging community through doing practical exercises. And we also developed a strategy for ecology up, where we start with ecology first and then build our spatial systems in the public spaces and these are the bunches of spatial systems that that has emerged from that. Our next strategy we'd like to share with you is going to be presented by Benjamin. You're on mute as well.
Thank you. So I'm just going to touch on a project which connects with what Kelly's been speaking about around a kind of inclusionary process to ensure that the residents around a piece of land are involved in shaping that piece of land, which obviously historically has not happened effectively. And this project is in a sort of example, it's an in-development project which has been created for the harnessing of power of people from different sectors, and most importantly, the local residents. and then aligned around a co-created vision, working with the kind of complex urban conditions, where all the built environment professionals, including engineers, either had or have developed through the process co-development and participatory skills. And the kind of juxtaposition of the site is important, that this site is a piece of land that has been allowed to be undeveloped, despite the rapid densification of the area around it through the development of informal settlements. And so, as you can see with the slide on the bottom left, there's a site with a sports pitch, and just to the top of that is an area of unused land. So predating this project, that entire piece of land was empty. Through the process of bringing together a group which really represents the main sectors. So government are involved, local residents with representatives, the management of the school where the site's located, academics from Cape Town and also from outside of South Africa who are specialists in urban development and co-development, the private sector and NGOs. And over time, starting with a very small project, which was created with a close participation of the local residents, the project has sort of grown across time. Could we, change slide, please? Can we go to the next slide? Thanks. So, I just wanted to give a quick kind of context on the project, that the area where it's located is punctuated by schools with large areas of unused land, and our group has, through this process, developed a model to activate that land, and from this process, the kind of key functions of the land is around education and training, around food security, around creating an economic model to sustain it that does not rely on government and contributes to the local economy, and also around health, which has become even more poignant with the pandemic. And the priority function, which has been ascertained through extensive research and engagement, is around the early childhood development training and a centre. Next slide, please. And part of this process has been around creating a resilient and inclusive site. And so the threats are, as with the entire world, around climate change. So through some technical expertise, some environmental engineers, landscape architects and architects, there's been a climate adaptive strategy that's been created. There's been a process around the building systems, which is modular and can be adapted to sort of different sites and different configurations. And part of the process means that this model that has been created will mean that for every different site, there will be a different arrangement within that site. But with some core elements, which is just the foundation being this inclusionary process. And as we've gone through this sort of journey, which has been over a long time, and it's been a lot of very small steps, lots of failings, lots of learnings, the sort of relevance of the project grew, and is now, through the invitation of the provincial government, is the test bed through the Department of Human Settlements for activating unused land at schools. And the importance of that within this talk is that at this point now, we can legitimately say that this is now engaging in some sort of systems change. It's within government policy, and it's an active project where the learnings are shared and are now influencing what's called the Living Cape framework. And this sum diagram really just is a kind of illustration of kind of how our group is sort of sitting as a kind of backbone to the project, with a combination of local representation professionals, and is working with these different sectors, leveraging them all around the shared vision. And the kind of product effectively is the Lukhanyo Hub, but if it's really just a space to kind of develop the model. And as has been highlighted throughout the talk, the essential ingredient is co-development, is the participatory design and the involvement of the very people who will be using that, and making sure that it is representative and not exclusionary as the apartheid system is, and as its legacy is still manifested in the spatial arrangement of where the Lukhanyo Hub is. So these images just kind of capturing some of the workshops with government, NGOs, academics, private sector, to kind of co-create the vision. And this is revisited in different ways, with events, with interviews, with writings, with different sort of techniques. And what's important is that all of the people involved, both engineers and architects and others, are all developing these skills, which is allowing them to be a lot more effective, to actually create better impact through the core training that they've had, to be able to be more relevant as we look to the future and all participate in trying to deal with these kind of global problems. And the only real solutions which will be resilient are the ones which are inclusionary. This is final image really is just around, or one of the final images is just from the policy document featuring the Lukhanyo Hub. Next slide, please. And then the final images just kind of relate to just an illustration of the site within its context. And then the next image just shows how with the next version, which will be on adjacent school sites on a roughly 1 kilometer radius, will be developed, and the Integrated Sustainable Development Foundation is tasked, its mission is to facilitate the conditions to complete the Lukhanyo Hub project, to document that, and to enable other sites to be activated to create a joined up network across Khayelitsha and into other areas. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ben. So just very quickly, the next strategy was Inverting Barriers in the apartheid city. And here was a project that we explored this idea of making the negative space of the leftover space between racially segregated neighborhoods actually the center, and rethinking infrastructure in this case. The fourth strategy is how to influence the decision makers, in other words, those who have the cash. And we demonstrated to a shopping center owner that if you looked at all the land that they've allocated to parking, that if you reimagine that, you could possibly make a city. Strategy 5 was to rescribe, and this is a project where we made an argument of how we established a scaffold, and the scaffold allowed people to occupy the scaffold over time. So where a library in this case was an ideal location for exploring the idea of the knowledge of ourselves as a collective happening as part of the library function. And over time, you can see various actors can find space for themselves there. Strategy 6 was implementing at scale, and we working with Faldi on this project, where we're developing a large mixed income neighborhood that's integrated into some of the existing neighbors, and it's a demonstration project for a local government to demonstrate that it's possible to have low-income people living in the same neighborhood as higher income earners. Harnessing time, so incrementalism is something that is not new to all of us, and we've developed a tool set alongside the ideas that Elemental had produced in the work in Chile, and that we implement some initial bits of work, but that rely on time and people's individual inputs to make a more nuanced neighborhood over time. Also took some lessons of the book Making Massive Small Change, which I recommend that you guys have a look at. Our final strategy, of course, is the one that Valdi will talk to. And that is that you can't only be a professional, but you also have to be an activist to make a difference. Valdi? You're muted, Valdi. Yeah, there we go.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Yes, Cape Town is a very different environment to anywhere in Europe. I've lived in a few cities, so I should know a little bit about that. Just in terms of where Cape Town is going, though, it sees itself as being a fairly modern city, a part of a global network. It also has goals to be carbon neutral by the year 2050. It's part of what's called the C40 initiative, where they're involved with mayors around the world to adapt strategies for combating climate change. So in South Africa, and particularly in Cape Town, we do have the idea that we can develop new spaces with the idea that you could effectively have a net zero environment for around particular buildings. Okay, so the C40 initiative that Cape Town had adapted was to be part of what's called the Reinventing Cities competition. There's a site in Athlone that the city had identified, a little car park next to a train station that could be developed as a net zero type building. In fact, they put it out as a competition, as part of a global competition with just about every other city around the world, Reykjavik and Dubai and Auckland and some of the European cities, all part of that. I think Cape Town's adjudication committee is still sitting at the moment, so I can't show you too much about this particular project, because Khalid and I did enter into that competition. But we have a bit of a passion for it because we actually grew up in Athlone. The site that the city had chosen is, like I said, indicated in red on the far left-hand corner, next to the railway line and the train station. And it actually is on the edge of the Athlone CBD. The Athlone CBD is an area which is no different to many areas around the world that has gone into decay over time. As a result, in our case, Athlone, its demise kind of was a result of two things. One, it was a very kind of engineering scenario where, as Khalid always kind of tells me, traffic engineers are the worst. So they decided to divert the road that actually went through the Athlone CBD, which obviously had, it wasn't at capacity and it needed to be increased. And so they actually diverted the road, on the edge of the CBD. And it meant that it starved business with that through traffic, right? And many examples around the world, of that happening. You go to Richmond in London, and you go to Tooting Bec in London, or even in Scotland, you go to certain areas. Princess Street isn't what it used to be. But I'm sure in Ireland you probably have the same sort of setup. That's so a technical thing has happened that kind of led to its demise. But the second thing that kind of happened to Athlone was the fall of apartheid. You know, so apartheid normally has been for us been a great thing, right? But what happened to Athlone was that people who lived in that particular area, who traded in that area, was now all of a sudden allowed to trade in other areas around the country, which meant that traditionally where Black entrepreneurs were operating in kind of silo environments, they were, you know, more likely to kind of move their money into areas where, you know, they had a better value and a better return on their investment. And the fact that we became a free nation, right? So effectively they could trade anywhere. So Athlone kind of, you know, fell by the wayside. In the 70s and the 80s, it had 3 cinemas and all these banks. It had a library and a magistrate's court, all of the kind of things that kind of makes a neighborhood. And since the 90s and the release of Nelson Mandela, you know, that decay started kicking in. Today, Athlone is an area that has no major retailers in it. It doesn't have any housing developments in it. It doesn't have any other than kind of very minor retail. It's very much an area that is in decay. But it has some good things going for it, right? I mean, it's on the major transport routes. You know, it has a major freeway running through it. It's a taxi rank. It has a train station and a railway line next to it. And more importantly, as Khalid kind of mentioned earlier about, you know, this incremental planning process that happens when we kind of developing new things, is that Athlone actually is a zoned area for mixed use, right? So this is currently what Athlone looks like from, you know, a bird's eye view, with kind of 2- and 3-story buildings, and effectively, without much to do, it could be turned into a fairly well-structured mixed-use type development, because the zoning for that is in place. If you don't mind going to the next slide. Emma? Next slide, please.
Oh, sorry, were you talking to me there, Valerie? I don't have your presentation of it. Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, thank you. So yeah, so I mean, that's just kind of representation that effectively you can bulk up the Athlone area quite easily without having to go through a big rezoning process. And that kind of, for us, presented an opportunity as to how we can turn a fairly derelict area into something that allows for mixed-use development. And for us, mixed-use means having both, you know, retail and offices and residential and education functions in it. So we started with the CBD, and we kind of expanded some of the projects so that we could move things around rather than kind of just looking at the CBD as one space. Next slide. Khalid, you got the presentation?
Yeah, I think it's taking a bit of time to get through to you, Faldi.
Okay, all right, thanks. Okay, so that's where we started, you know, and Athlone was, you know, as part of a bigger green lung with some fairly big green spaces in an urban context. It has a football stadium, a swimming pool. It has hockey fields and soccer, so football is probably the biggest sport in Cape Town, and rugby obviously following not far behind. And all of those kind of you know, spaces are available, you know, around that Athlone area. And we've developed a process that you can kind of link these spaces as we go along. Down to the south of it are 2 major schools that effectively was the hotbed of the anti-apartheid struggle called Alexander Sinton and Belgravia High. And that linked into a sports field called the City Park, which is on the next slide, Khalid, and which we'll talk about a little bit later. So the first project we kind of identified in Athlone was was now really a defunct technical college that used to train motor mechanics. You know, I mean, not that you kind of need a motor mechanic much nowadays. You know, you take your car in and they put it on some computer and they tell you what you need to kind of do, and you pay, right? So the need for kind of having big workshops for motor mechanics, you know, has been in decline. And this particular college is you know, it's 50 meters from the CBD of Cape Town, of Athlone. So we developed a scheme to actually turn that into a social housing project, purely because it's located next to a fairly large urban space that is mainly social housing. But we tried to incorporate some of the concepts of having what's called a 15-minute neighborhood with having both residential spaces where people could, you know, participate in sport, and then have a space to kind of run a workshop or a business. But look, I mean, the facility is still operational, and we had made a presentation to government to say, you know, why don't you take the students who are in this particular space and utilize some of the buildings in Athlone to accommodate the education function. So turn the college into a social housing environment, and then move those students out of there into Athlone and occupy some of the buildings. Particularly, we see Athlone as being an opportunity for the ICT sector, right? So the idea of training young people in computers technology and Internet of Things is starting to become a big thing in Cape Town, particularly. In fact, we have a situation where we have, for every one person that we've trained, one person that we've trained, we've got 3 opportunities for them to work in Cape Town particularly. Yeah, we don't have enough people in that space. The second project we did was called the Standard Bank building, which effectively is an old bank. You know, I'm sure it's the same for you guys in other parts of the world. We don't need banks anymore, right? I mean, all do our banking on the internet. And this particular bank, which is a national bank in South Africa, Standard Bank, their building just became derelict, standing empty. But it's right next to the taxi rank, and we felt that we could kind of turn that into a housing opportunity by retaining the retail on the ground floor and adding 3 floors of residential into that space that allows Athlone to function more on the basis of having people there throughout the day, right? At the moment it closes at 5 o'clock because the CBD shuts down and everybody goes home and they go into their dormitory little towns Khalid keeps talking about. The other space we looked at was called City Park, which I kind of mentioned earlier, also as a kind of a mixed-use environment. You know, like I said, rugby is a big thing in Cape Town. You know, the Lions played at what was called the Cape Town Stadium, which is, you know, is designed and built in a massive park, which Khalid designed, by the way. You know, and that's kind of where men play rugby, right? The woman is sent to City Park, which is on the outskirts of Athlone. Okay, on the next picture, yeah. So kind of just to identify that we're still in the same city is the Table Mountain in the background. but that's where, this is the home of women's rugby in South Africa. You know, I mean, that's where our national team, the women's team, actually practice and play some of their games. And I mean, it is a dump, unfortunately. And that's the disparity. Not only we kind of do that in terms of race, but we also do that in terms of gender in the city. So, so we went through a process with the rugby union to see whether we could turn that into a fairly decent rugby facility, but at the same time introduce a social housing component to it. You know, an opportunity for the rugby union to kind of get some income from it by introducing a restaurant and a coffee shop and all kinds of other things, which they would quite like the idea, and hopefully in next year we will start building it again, because part of it's zoned already for that use. So that's a key for us, is to kind of look at existing spaces and how you can use zoning rather than having to go through the whole process and EIA and, you know, all of those other things I'm sure you guys are very familiar with, right? The last one was very ambitious. Khalid and I put this together, but we effectively had to speak to 5 different owners or building owners to say, could you add your building or your particular property into the mix? We designed these buildings in a way that effectively they are sitting on separate urban, but they were combined in terms of the way we kind of put it together, but they're effectively separate buildings on separate earths. But we've got to a stage now where we literally got buy-in from 3 of the owners. Hopefully in the next few months we will get buy-in from the rest of them. But effectively we have a project that is zoned, you know, again, Khalid will tell you it's going to be building plan submission and off we go. Yeah, so these we've kind of looked at it and looking at how do you look at urban regeneration in environments that effectively they hold low-hanging fruit. And we particularly looked at it from a point of view of the social component, of how do you kind of integrate the social component into effectively, you know, a net zero strategy. Because many of the things that we do see is that we concentrate on the things like the environment, and, you know, in ESG, we always get reminded that we kind of leave the social bits out of it, right? And, you know, we put solar panels on the roof, and we you know, we recycle our water and our waste and all those kind of wonderful things, but we forget that it's about people and where they live and how they live. So yeah, and that's what we've been doing.
Thanks, Valdi. Just to wrap up very quickly then, so we can have time to still have a conversation. There's a well-known saying in Africa which says that I stand on the shoulders of my father, and he stood on the shoulders of his father, etc., etc. So the idea of us building the making of cities, of course, is the same in that we don't necessarily have to plan every detail forevermore, but that we understand that there's ways of doing and making that requires us to think of iteration. So the three sort of key takeaways, I guess, that we want to leave you with is that, first of all, that the richness and the quality of the making of cities is not held by one individual, but requires collaboration, and that builds complexity over time. The second, and I think it's probably most pertinent to the engineers around the table, is that we need to desperately counter the deterministic ways of designing the city. So, for example, demand in the destination may solve that particular problem. That equation solves that problem, but it offers no insight as to how to solve additional problems at the same time. So if you shift the demand and you shift the destination, what does that provide for the making of the city? And then, of course, you know, without saying the making of cities got to deal with the paradoxes in how we make a city. to achieve a just and equal society. Thank you, Emma. Emma, shall we leave it at that? And we're happy to take some questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll pop on video there. Thanks so much, guys. Yeah, so for everyone here, just we'll throw it out to you now. Open the floor to you for any questions or comments that you have for the guys before we wrap up. Thanks for some of the feedback that we got in the chat so far as well. I know some people might have to jump off.
I just wanted to make a point that yeah, the whole Athlone project is I think Fadi was being very modest by not mentioning that it's actually an example of being an activist, of not waiting for government to kind of come forward and actually working tirelessly over a long period of time to try and create systemic change at a large scale, like a full district scale. So all the work that was communicated is basically been driven through principles and values and passion, and it's creating change. And if that kind of approach is taken en masse, then there's reason to be hopeful for the future.
Absolutely, exactly, and yeah, reframing all. It's really fascinating. Well, fascinating presentations from all of you. Certainly, Khalid, I think you just gave such excellent context and kind of looking at some really important historical, social, cultural aspects and how it plays out. And really, so interesting to hear your description of traffic engineering and how that leads into spatial and social and racial justice. It certainly got me thinking about context here in Ireland in a different way. And yeah, you can see the import of roads and from a whole new light. But yeah, sorry, we do have one question there, I think. Yeah, Han Fershura, do you want to pop it into the chat there? The question that you have? Unless perhaps I'm missing it, or I can maybe see if I can just unmute you there. 1 second. Okay, I've just allowed you to talk there now, Han, if you want to jump in.
Okay, do you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, we do indeed.
Okay, well, my question, and I'll take the example of the Athlone CBD project that you illustrated. You actually make it a more dense and higher compact commercial blocks, probably because you say central business district. But my question is, I would think that several of these locations are locations that really require more an identity of a neighborhood, where indeed you have a neighborhood center, but a neighborhood does not necessarily mean a CBD as we used to have it in the modern times. It looks to me a bit as if you have covered a parking space that you had before, the open parking place, and then you just cover it with buildings, and then particularly commercial buildings. And I think there must be another way, is to create a stronger identity to separate neighborhoods where the compactness does not come. The compactness does not come from higher buildings, even not single commercial ones, but come from a mix of functions where artisanal activities, some commercial, some light industrial, non-polluting, residential are a bit mixed together, and where the compactness comes.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Could I ask maybe if you're sharing comment, maybe we just pause there now for the guys to come back, or just to clarify, was it just the comments that you wanted to share, or did you have a specific question there?
No,
so we'll just need
I have a question of a different type of fill-in to the city, a different design, urban space fill-in, not create again more CBD, but less CBD, but more neighborhood type of compactness.
Okay, so I'll pass that to the guys, and then we'll just need to wrap up after that, actually, guys. But yeah, if any of the panelists would like to come back to Han there.
Yeah, Emma, thanks for that, Han. It's actually the Athlone presentation is part of a much bigger presentation that we put together, which unfortunately, because of the limit in time, we didn't present here. But the fact that this area is zoned for mixed use, the intention is to kind of lose the concept that it's a CBD, but it actually is a mixed facility that allows for commercial, residential, and work and play in all kind of one space, in an environment that effectively is devoid of cars over time. So yes, I hear you, and maybe, Emma, when we have time to do another presentation just on Athlone, we could expand on that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That was very useful. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay then, guys, thank you so much. And I hope you've all taken as much from it as I have. And guys, I look forward to speaking with you again soon. But otherwise, take care, guys. And we'll certainly keep you posted about all our webinars and any events coming up next year. So mind yourselves wherever you are in the world. Take care, guys. Bye.
Bye.
Yes. Okay.
Bye.
Bye, guys. Thanks, guys.